The morning sun cast long shadows across the military airfield as Sergeant James Wilson stood at attention. His Royal Guard uniform was perfectly pressed, not a button or medal out of place. Today, his duty was one that weighed heavily on his heart. He was to escort the body of Private Thomas Reed back home to his family. Private Reed had died last week during a mission overseas. He was only 22 years old. He had jumped on a grenade to save 3 of his friends. His brave act had earned him the highest honor, but James knew no medal could ease the pain his family would feel. "Are you ready, Sergeant?" asked Captain Harris, walking up beside him. "Yes, sir," James replied, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. This was his first time escorting a fallen soldier home. He wanted to do everything right. The military plane carrying Private Reed's coffin landed with a gentle thud. James watched as 6 soldiers carefully removed the flag-draped coffin from the plane. The men moved slowly, with deep respect for their fallen brother. James felt his throat tighten as they placed the coffin into the transport vehicle. "You'll fly commercial to get him home," Captain Harris explained. "There's a connecting flight through Denver. His parents will be waiting at the final destination." James nodded. "I understand the responsibility, sir. I won't leave his side." The drive to the commercial airport was quiet. James sat in the back of the military van next to the coffin. He thought about Private Reed's family waiting for their son to come home. James had never met them, but he had spoken to Reed's mother on the phone yesterday. Her voice had cracked when she thanked him for bringing her boy home. "Please take care of him," she had said. "He was our only child." James had promised her he would. It was a promise he intended to keep. At the airport, a special team helped transfer Private Reed's coffin to a cart that would move through the airport. The coffin remained covered with the American flag, a sign of respect for a fallen hero. People stopped and stared as James guided the cart through the entrance. Some placed their hands over their hearts. Others simply bowed their heads. An older man in a worn veteran's cap stood up from his seat and saluted as they passed. James returned the salute, grateful for the show of respect. At the check-in counter, the airline staff had been notified in advance. A young woman named Sarah stepped forward. "Sergeant Wilson, we've been expecting you," she said. "We've arranged for you and Private Reed to board first. We want to make this as smooth as possible." "Thank you," James said. "I appreciate that." Sarah handed him 2 boarding passes, one for you and one for Private Reed. It's airline policy that, well, everyone needs a boarding pass. James took the passes and nodded. He understood. Rules were rules, even at a time like this. "Your first flight leaves in an hour," Sarah explained. "You'll need to go through security first. I've called ahead to let them know you're coming." James thanked her again and began pushing the cart toward security. People moved aside to let him pass, many stopping to watch the solemn procession. Children asked their parents questions in hushed voices. The usual noise of the busy airport seemed to fade away around him. As he approached the security checkpoint, James noticed a group of airport staff talking urgently. One of them, a stern-looking man in a suit, kept glancing in his direction. James felt a flicker of concern. Something told him that his journey with Private Reed might not be as smooth as Sarah had promised. The man in the suit started walking toward him, his face set in a frown. James straightened his back and took a deep breath. Whatever was about to happen, he would handle it. He had made a promise to bring Private Reed home with dignity and respect. Nothing would stop him from keeping that promise. The man in the suit reached James and held up his hand to stop him. His name tag read Robert Miller, Security Supervisor. "Sergeant Wilson, I need to speak with you about security procedures," Robert said, his voice firm. James nodded politely. "Of course, sir. What seems to be the problem?" Robert pointed to the flag-draped coffin. "I understand your situation, but all items must go through the security scanner. No exceptions." James felt his heart beat faster. He kept his face calm, but inside he was worried. The thought of Private Reed's coffin being treated like regular luggage didn't feel right. "Sir, with all due respect, I have military clearance papers," James said, pulling out a folder from his jacket. "The proper authorities have approved this escort mission. The coffin cannot be opened or scanned." Robert barely looked at the papers. "I'm sorry, Sergeant. Airport rules are clear. Everything must be checked. We can do it in a private room if you prefer." By now, people nearby had started to watch. An older couple stopped rolling their suitcases. A young mother with 2 children stood nearby, explaining quietly to her curious kids what was happening. "This is Private Thomas Reed," James said, his voice low but strong. "He died saving 3 of his fellow soldiers. He deserves to be treated with honor." Robert crossed his arms. "Rules are rules, Sergeant. Security comes first." A small crowd had gathered now. James could feel their eyes on him. He thought about Private Reed's mother, waiting for her son. He had promised her dignity and respect for her boy. "Perhaps we can call your supervisor," James suggested. "There must be a way to respect both security needs and the honor of a fallen soldier." Robert shook his head. "I am the supervisor on duty. The decision is final." An elderly man stepped forward from the crowd. He wore a Vietnam veteran's hat and walked with a slight limp. "Excuse me," the old veteran said. "May I say something?" Robert looked annoyed, but nodded. "I fought in Vietnam," the old man said. "I lost my best friend there. His body came home just like this young man's." He pointed to the coffin. "Back then, people didn't always show respect to soldiers. It was a different time. But this," he paused, emotion in his voice, "this is wrong." A woman in a business suit spoke up next. "My brother serves in the military. If anything happened to him, I would want him treated with respect." More voices joined in. The crowd grew larger. People pulled out their phones and started recording. James stood straight and silent, his hand resting lightly on the flag covering Private Reed's coffin. A young airport employee rushed up to Robert and whispered something in his ear. Robert's face changed as he listened. He looked at the growing crowd, then at the phones recording the scene. "There's been a miscommunication," Robert announced suddenly. "After reviewing the military clearance, I see that Sergeant Wilson has the proper authorization. You may proceed." James nodded, not showing the relief he felt inside. "Thank you, sir." As James pushed the cart forward, the crowd parted to make way. The old veteran saluted as James passed. Others placed hands over their hearts. A young boy of about 10 stepped forward and placed a small paper airplane on top of the coffin. "My dad is a soldier too," the boy said simply. James smiled at the child. "I'm sure he's very proud of you." The boy's mother, with tears in her eyes, gently guided her son back. As James continued toward his gate, he noticed something remarkable happening. Word was spreading through the airport. People stopped what they were doing. Store workers stepped outside their shops. Travelers paused their rushing. The usual noise of the busy airport faded away. And in that silence, James felt the weight of his duty more clearly than ever. He was not just carrying a coffin. He was carrying the honor of a hero, the love of a family, and now, the respect of hundreds of strangers. The morning of King Charles's coronation started with bright sunshine over London. The sky was clear blue, and the air felt fresh. Crowds had been waiting since early morning. People lined the streets with flags and flowers. They all wanted to see the royal family. The big black car stopped in front of Westminster Abbey. The door opened, and out stepped Prince William. He wore his Navy military uniform with gold buttons that shined in the sun. Medals hung on his chest, showing his service to the country. His face looked serious but proud. Next came Princess Kate. She wore a white dress with tiny flowers sewn on it. A small silver tiara sat on her head, holding a thin veil that blew gently in the wind. She smiled and waved at the crowds who cheered loudly for her. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. 9-year-old Prince George stepped out of the car. He wore a small version of his father's uniform. His blonde hair was neatly combed, and he tried hard to look grown up. He stood straight and tall next to his father. 7-year-old Princess Charlotte came next. Her long hair was braided with small white flowers. She wore a white dress that matched her mother's. Charlotte held Kate's hand tightly and gave a small wave to the people. Her smile was shy but sweet. Last came 5-year-old Prince Louis. The youngest royal bounced out of the car with energy. He wore a dark blue suit that matched his bright blue eyes. Louis couldn't stand still. He pointed at the tall Abbey building, the horses, and the guards with red coats. He waved with both hands at the crowd, who laughed and waved back. "Look at the horses," Louis shouted, pulling at William's hand. William bent down and whispered something in his ear. Louis nodded but still couldn't hide his excitement. The family walked toward the Abbey doors. Hundreds of cameras flashed around them. Charlotte noticed her little brother was getting too excited. She reached for his hand. "Remember what Mommy said," she whispered to him. Louis tried to stand straighter, but his eyes still darted everywhere with wonder. Inside the Abbey, the light came through colored glass windows. It made patterns on the stone floor. Louis stopped walking and pointed up. "Look at the colors," he said loudly. Kate gently put her hand on his shoulder to guide him forward. George walked ahead, copying his father's steady steps. The Abbey was filled with important people from around the world. Kings, queens, presidents, and prime ministers sat in rows. They all turned to watch the royal family walk down the long aisle. William nodded at people he knew. Kate smiled gracefully. The children tried their best to remember their manners. They reached their seats at the front of the Abbey. William helped George sit properly. Kate fixed Charlotte's dress. Louis climbed onto his seat and started swinging his legs. Kate gave him a small book she had brought to keep him busy. As the music began to play, the huge doors at the back of the Abbey opened again. King Charles entered wearing a long red robe. Everyone stood up. George and Charlotte stood straight and still. Louis stood on his tiptoes to see better. The children watched with wide eyes as their grandfather walked slowly toward the golden chair at the front. This was the moment they had practiced for. They were part of history now. But to everyone watching at home, they weren't just royal children following rules. They were a normal family of 5, trying their best on an extraordinary day. William caught Kate's eye across the children's heads. They shared a quick smile. No matter how important this day was for the country, their family came first. And today, their family was helping make a very old tradition feel new and alive. The coronation ceremony began. The Abbey fell quiet. King Charles sat on the special chair that had been used for hundreds of years. Prince William watched his father with pride. Kate sat straight, helping her children understand what was happening. Prince George leaned forward in his seat. He knew one day he would be king too. He watched everything carefully. His blue eyes didn't miss a single detail. When the crown came out, carried on a red pillow, George whispered to his father, "It's so shiny." William nodded and put his arm around George's shoulders. Princess Charlotte sat very still. She copied her mother's perfect posture. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. When important people spoke, Charlotte listened with her head tilted. She was trying to remember everything for her school friends. Prince Louis was having a harder time. The ceremony was long, and there were many quiet parts. He started to swing his legs under his seat. Kate gave him a small smile and took a tiny toy from her purse. Louis played with it quietly for a few minutes. Then came a moment when everyone had to be completely silent. The Archbishop held the heavy crown above King Charles's head. Louis chose this exact moment to ask in a loud whisper, "Is it my turn to wear a crown too?" His voice echoed in the quiet Abbey. People sitting nearby tried not to laugh. Charlotte's eyes went wide. She put her finger to her lips to remind her brother to be quiet. George looked embarrassed for a second, but then smiled at his little brother. Kate bent down and whispered in Louis's ear. She told him he needed to be quiet just a little longer. She promised they would have cake later. Louis nodded and tried his best to sit still. The crown was placed on King Charles's head. Trumpets suddenly blasted loud music. Louis jumped in surprise and covered his ears. His face scrunched up in shock at the noise. The cameras caught his reaction. Later, this picture would make people around the world smile. After the loud music, Louis relaxed again. But the ceremony continued. More speeches were made. More prayers were said. Louis began to get tired. He leaned against his mother and yawned. His big yawn was caught on camera too. Charlotte noticed her little brother was getting sleepy. She reached into her small purse and took out a mint. She quietly passed it to Louis. This small act of kindness didn't go unnoticed. People watching saw how the royal children cared for each other. William kept checking on his children. He was both a father and the future king today. When Louis started to fidget again, William caught his eye and made a funny face that only Louis could see. Louis covered his mouth to stop a giggle. About halfway through the ceremony, there was a break in the formal parts. The choir began to sing. The music was beautiful and filled the huge abbey. George closed his eyes to listen. Charlotte swayed gently to the music. Louis, now fully awake again, started to conduct the music with his hands, waving his arms like the real conductor. Kate tried to gently lower Louis's arms, but the people sitting near them were smiling. Even King Charles noticed his youngest grandson's enthusiasm from his throne. He gave a small wink in Louis's direction. The choir finished their song. Now it was time for the most sacred part of the ceremony. Holy oil was brought out in a golden container. Louis's eyes grew wide at the sight of it. "What's that?" he whispered to Charlotte. She leaned over and explained it was special oil for Grandpa's head. As the ceremony continued, the children's different personalities shone through. George remained serious and thoughtful. Charlotte stayed graceful and helpful. Louis brought joy and realness to the ancient tradition. People watching at home weren't just seeing a coronation. They were seeing a family. The cameras kept finding the children's faces. Their honest reactions made the formal event feel human and warm. By the middle of the ceremony, the royal children had already stolen the show. The ceremony continued for another hour. Even the adults were getting tired. Prince Louis couldn't sit still any longer. He started looking around the abbey at all the decorations. He spotted a big golden eagle high on the wall. "Look," he said, pointing up. His voice was louder than he meant it to be. Kate placed her hand gently on his arm to lower it. She gave him a small book from her purse. Louis opened it and found pictures of the coronation to color. Kate had thought ahead. She knew her youngest would need something to do. Prince George watched the holy oil being placed on his grandfather's head. He sat up straighter, knowing this moment was important. One day, many years from now, this would happen to his father. And then, someday, to him. George's face was serious. He looked much older than 9 years old in that moment. Princess Charlotte noticed how well her older brother was behaving. She tried to be just as good. When Louis dropped his coloring pencil and it rolled under the seat, Charlotte quickly bent down to get it before it could make noise. She handed it back to him with a soft "She." The ceremony reached the part where King Charles had to hold the royal scepter and orb. These were heavy gold objects with jewels. Louis's eyes grew wide at the sight of them. "They're like treasure," he whispered. This time he remembered to keep his voice down. Kate gave him a proud smile. A funny moment happened when Louis tried to show George something in his coloring book. As he turned to his brother, Louis accidentally bumped Charlotte's arm. Charlotte's small tiara slipped sideways on her head. William noticed and reached over to straighten it. The 3 children started to giggle quietly. Kate tried to keep a serious face, but her eyes showed she was trying not to laugh too. William's shoulders shook slightly with silent laughter. Even in this most formal setting, they were still just a normal family with children being children. The cameras caught this sweet family moment. Later, people would say this was their favorite part of the whole coronation. It showed that even royal families have real moments together. As the ceremony moved toward its end, Louis began to get sleepy again. The excitement and early morning had worn him out. He leaned against his mother's side, and his eyes started to close. Charlotte noticed and moved closer to help support her little brother. But Louis wasn't asleep for long. The choir began singing again, and the music was loud and beautiful. Louis sat up straight, suddenly awake. He began moving his head to the music. When everyone stood up to sing, Louis sang along loudly, even though he didn't know all the words. George tried to help him follow along, pointing to the words in the program. The two brothers shared a smile. William noticed and felt proud of his sons. Even though they were different, they helped each other. As the music ended, it was time for King Charles to walk down the aisle wearing his crown. Everyone stood up. The royal family would follow behind him. Kate made sure all three children were standing straight and looking smart. "Remember to walk slowly," Kate reminded them quietly, "and wave to the people when we get outside." Louis nodded seriously, but then he asked in a loud whisper that people nearby could hear, "Can I wear Grandpa's crown when we get home?" This made several people around them smile. As they prepared to walk, William knelt down to his children's level. "You've all done so well today," he told them. "I'm very proud of you." The three children beamed at their father's praise. Charlotte smoothed her dress. George stood taller. Louis gave a little jump of excitement. The abbey doors opened. Sunlight streamed in. The crowds outside cheered as King Charles appeared wearing his crown. Now it was time for the royal family to step outside and greet the people. An even bigger adventure was about to begin. As they lined up to walk, the three children stood together. They knew something special was happening. They might not understand everything about the day, but they knew their family was important. And more importantly, they had each other. The carriage stopped in front of Buckingham Palace. Helpers in red uniforms opened the door. Prince William stepped out first. He turned to help his family. Princess Kate stepped down gracefully. Then came the children. George climbed out carefully. He thanked the helper who held his hand. Charlotte stepped down like a little lady. Louis jumped from the last step, almost giving the helper a fright. William caught him just in time. "Careful, Louis," William said with a smile. Louis nodded but was too excited to really listen. He was looking at the huge palace in front of them. "Is this where Grandpa lives now?" Louis asked loudly. People nearby heard and smiled. "Yes, this is Grandpa's house now," Kate explained. She took Louis's hand to make sure he stayed close. The family walked up the steps and into the palace. Inside, everything was grand. The floors were shiny. The walls had gold designs. Huge paintings hung everywhere. Louis wanted to touch everything. "Don't touch," Charlotte reminded him softly. She was being the helpful big sister. The family was taken to a special room to wait. Other royal family members were there too. Aunts, uncles, and cousins all dressed in their best clothes. The children's cousins ran over to say hello. "Did you see all the people?" one cousin asked George. George nodded seriously. "I waved at everybody," Louis announced proudly. The other children laughed. While the children talked, servants brought in drinks and small sandwiches. The family had been at the ceremony for hours and everyone was hungry. Kate made sure her children used their best manners while eating. Louis picked up a small cake. Just as he was about to take a big bite, a servant announced, 5 minutes until the balcony appearance. Louis almost dropped his cake in surprise. Charlotte quickly handed him a napkin to wipe his fingers. George straightened his uniform jacket. "Remember to stand still on the balcony," William reminded the children. "And wave to the people when we get there." The family lined up to walk to the famous Buckingham Palace balcony. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The newly crowned King Charles would stand on the balcony with his family. Millions of people would be watching on TV. They walked down a long hallway with red carpet. Louis ran his hands along the wall as they walked. Kate gently moved his hand away. At the end of the hall was a set of tall glass doors. Through the doors, they could see the balcony. King Charles was waiting for them. He wore his crown and royal robes. When he saw his grandchildren, his serious face broke into a warm smile. "Grandpa," Louis called out. He forgot the rules and ran to his grandfather. Everyone held their breath, worried about the proper way to greet a new king. But King Charles just laughed and bent down to hug Louis. "Hello, my boy," he said kindly. "Did you enjoy the ceremony?" "It was long," Louis said honestly, "but I liked the music and the horses." The adults laughed. Even kings need honest opinions sometimes. The glass doors opened. Bright sunlight poured in. The sounds of the crowd outside grew louder. Thousands of people were packed into the area in front of the palace. They were cheering and waving flags. "It's time," King Charles said. He straightened his robes and prepared to step outside. The royal family lined up in order. King Charles would go first, then Queen Camilla, then William and Kate with their children. Other royal family members would follow. George stood tall, ready for his duty. Charlotte smoothed her dress one last time. Louis bounced on his toes, trying to see through the doors. "Remember," Kate whispered to the children, "this is a very important moment. People will remember today forever." The doors opened fully. King Charles took a deep breath and stepped onto the balcony. The crowd roared with cheers. It was so loud that Louis covered his ears for a moment. William put his hand on George's shoulder. "Ready?" he asked his son. George nodded. The family prepared to step out and face the world. The most exciting part of the day was about to begin. The royal family stepped onto the famous balcony. The crowd below went wild with cheers. There were so many people that the ground looked like a sea of faces. Everyone was waving flags and taking pictures. King Charles stood in the middle, wearing his crown and royal robes. He raised his hand to wave, and the crowd cheered even louder. Beside him stood Queen Camilla in her white dress and smaller crown. Prince William and Princess Kate guided their children to their spots. They stood to the right of the king. William stood tall and proud next to his father. Kate looked beautiful and calm as always. The three children lined up in front of their parents. George on the left, Charlotte in the middle, and Louis on the right. They had practiced where to stand. Now it was time to show everyone how well they could do it. George stood like a small soldier. His back was straight, and his face was serious. He raised his hand and gave a perfect royal wave. People pointed at him and said, "Look at the future king." Charlotte smiled sweetly at the crowd. She waved her hand the way her mother had taught her. Not too fast and not too slow. Her eyes moved across the crowd, trying to see everything. Louis was too excited to stand still. He waved with so much energy that his whole body moved. Then he saw something that made his eyes grow wide. Airplanes were coming. In the distance, the sound of airplane engines grew louder. The Royal Air Force was doing a special flyover for the coronation. Big planes painted in red, white, and blue colors were heading straight for the palace. "Look," Louis shouted, pointing to the sky. His voice was loud enough that the microphones nearby picked it up. People watching on TV heard him and smiled. The planes came closer. They flew right over Buckingham Palace in perfect lines. The noise was very loud. Colored smoke came from some planes, making lines of red, white, and blue in the sky. Louis had never heard anything so loud. He put his hands over his ears and made a funny face. His mouth opened wide, and his eyes squinted shut. Cameras caught this honest reaction, and the image would soon be seen around the world. Charlotte noticed her little brother was scared of the noise. She moved closer to him and put her arm around his shoulders. This sweet moment between brother and sister touched everyone who saw it. William bent down to speak to Louis. "It's okay," he said. "The planes are saying hello to Grandpa." Louis nodded but kept his hands over his ears until the loudest planes had passed. The last group of planes left trails of colored smoke that made a perfect Union Jack flag in the sky. The crowd below clapped and cheered. Even George looked impressed by this amazing sight. As the noise of the planes faded, Louis dropped his hands from his ears. He started waving again with renewed energy. His honest reactions made everyone smile. He was just being a normal 5-year-old boy on a very unusual day. Kate put her hand on Louis's shoulder to help him calm down. She smiled proudly at all 3 of her children. They were doing so well on this long day. The royal family stayed on the balcony for 10 minutes. They waved to the crowds. They watched the air show. They smiled for the many cameras pointed at them. George stood perfectly still the whole time. He only moved his waving hand. Charlotte sometimes whispered things to her brothers, helping them know what to do. Louis kept moving around, pointing at things he saw and waving with big arm movements. As the time on the balcony came to an end, King Charles turned to his family. He said something that made them all smile. Then he led the way back inside the palace. Just before going through the doors, Louis turned and gave one last big wave to the crowd. He jumped up and down and called out, "Bye-bye." The people below laughed and waved back with love. The glass doors closed behind the royal family. The balcony appearance was over, but people would talk about it for days. The newspapers and TV shows would show pictures of the children, especially Louis with his hands over his ears. Once inside, William knelt down in front of his children. "You all did wonderfully," he said with a proud smile. "Especially you, Louis. You were very brave with a lot of planes." Louis beamed at his father's praise. The royal family might live in palaces and wear crowns, but they were still just a family who loved each other. And that's what people loved seeing most of all. After the balcony appearance, the royal family went to a large room in the palace. This room had high ceilings and golden chairs. Big windows let in bright sunlight. It was time for the official coronation photos. Photographers set up their cameras. Lights on tall stands filled the room. The royal family had to wait while everything was prepared. Louis walked around the room, looking at everything. He stopped at a big painting on the wall. "Who's that man?" he asked, pointing at the picture of an old king. William walked over to join his son. "That was your great-great-great-grandfather," he explained. "He was King George V." Louis looked at the painting with wide eyes. "He has a big beard," he said. Everyone nearby laughed. The photographer called for the family to take their places. Special chairs were set up for the important photo. King Charles sat in the middle on a throne-like chair. Queen Camilla sat beside him. William and Kate stood behind them. The children were told to stand in front of their parents. George stood straight and tall. Charlotte smoothed her dress and stood in the perfect spot. Louis tried to stand still, but he kept looking around at all the interesting things in the room. "Look at the camera, please," the photographer called. Everyone turned to face the camera. Louis was still looking at something else. "Louis," Kate said softly. Louis quickly turned to the camera. Just as the photographer was about to take the picture, Louis made a funny face. His nose wrinkled up and his eyes crossed. Charlotte saw what her brother was doing. She tried not to laugh. George kept his serious face, but his mouth twitched at the corners. "1, 2, 3, said the photographer. There was a bright flash. The first picture was taken. The photographer looked at the screen on his camera and frowned slightly. "Let's try one more," he said. "Young Prince Louis, can you give me a nice smile this time?" Louis nodded. He put on his best smile. The second picture was much better. The photographer took several more photos of different groups. The king with just William, Kate with just the children. All kinds of combinations. During a short break, servants brought in drinks and small cakes. The children were hungry after the long day. Louis picked up a cake with pink frosting. He took a big bite, getting frosting on his nose. Charlotte quickly took a napkin and helped clean her brother's face. "Like this," she said, showing him how to eat neatly. Louis tried to copy her, but cake crumbs still fell on his smart suit. George was talking with his grandfather, King Charles. They looked serious as they spoke. George asked questions about the crown and the ceremony. The king answered patiently, pleased by his grandson's interest. William watched his oldest son with pride. Someday George would be king too. These moments with his grandfather were important lessons. Kate helped Louis clean his hands after the cake. "Are we done now?" Louis asked. "Can we go play?" "Not yet," Kate said gently. "There's one more big event today. The parade through London." Louis's eyes lit up at the word parade. He loved parades with their music and excitement. "Will there be more horses?" he asked eagerly. "Yes, lots of horses," William promised. "And soldiers marching. And more cheering people." The children had a few minutes to rest. George sat in a big chair, looking at a book about the coronation that someone had given him. Charlotte sat beside her mother, talking quietly. Louis couldn't sit still. He walked around the room, looking out of each window. From one window, he could see the crowd still waiting outside. There were thousands of people. Many had been standing all day just to catch a glimpse of the royal family. "Look how many people came to see Grandpa become king," Louis said with wonder. William joined his son at the window. "They came to see all of us," he said. "And do you know who they especially loved seeing today?" Louis shook his head. "You three," William said, smiling at his children. "Everyone loves seeing you." A palace worker entered the room. "The carriages are ready, Your Royal Highness," he said to William with a small bow. It was time for the next part of their big day. The parade through London was about to begin. The children lined up by the door, excited for their next adventure. The royal family went outside to the palace yard, where beautiful carriages waited. These carriages were different from the ones they rode in earlier. These were bigger and more colorful. The main carriage was painted gold and had the royal coat of arms on the door. Workers in red uniforms stood ready to help the family into the carriages. Horses with white feathers on their heads stood perfectly still, waiting to pull the carriages through London. Louis ran toward the horses, excited to see them up close. "Louis, wait," Kate called, hurrying after him. William smiled at his son's energy. Even after this long day, Louis still had excitement to spare. King Charles and Queen Camilla got into the first carriage. William, Kate, and their children would ride in the second one. Other royal family members would follow in more carriages. Before they got in, a palace worker brought over small flags for the children to wave during the parade. George received a Union Jack flag. Charlotte got a flag with the royal coat of arms. Louis got one of each and held them tightly. William helped the children climb into the carriage. George went first, sitting straight on the red velvet seat. Charlotte followed, sitting beside her brother. Louis needed extra help because the step was high. Once inside, he bounced on the soft seat. Kate stepped in gracefully and sat opposite the children. William joined her. The carriage door closed with a click. Through the windows, they could see palace workers taking their places. Everything had to be perfect for the parade. "Wave your flags when you see people," Kate reminded the children. Louis immediately began practicing, waving his flag so hard that he almost hit George in the face. "Careful," George said, moving away from Louis's wild waving. Charlotte giggled at her brothers. The parade began. The carriages moved forward slowly, first through the palace gates, then out onto the London streets. The streets were lined with people, 10 or 20 deep in some places. Everyone cheered when they saw the royal carriages. "Wave," William reminded the children. All three waved their flags out the windows. The people cheered even louder when they saw the children. Louis was so excited that he kept standing up on the seat for a better view. Kate had to gently pull him down each time. "Stay seated, Louis," she said. "People can still see you." The carriage passed by famous London sights. They went by Trafalgar Square with its big lion statues. Louis pointed at the lions and roared like one. This made the people near the carriage laugh. Charlotte spotted a group of girls her age holding a sign that said, "We love Princess Charlotte." She waved directly at them and gave them a special smile. The girls jumped up and down with excitement. George noticed the soldiers marching beside the carriages. They kept perfect time, their boots hitting the ground together. George watched them with interest. trying to count how many steps they took. The sun began to set as the parade continued. The spring day was ending. Lights came on along the streets of London. The city looked magical in the golden evening light. Inside the carriage, the children started to get tired. It had been a very long day. Louis leaned against his mother, still waving his flags but with less energy now. Charlotte's perfect posture relaxed a little. Even George looked tired. Not much longer, William assured them, seeing their tired faces. You've all done so well today. As they neared the end of the parade route, people set off fireworks. Colorful bursts of light filled the sky. The children's faces lit up with wonder as they watched. Look, Louis said, pointing at a big red firework that spread across the sky. It's the same color as Grandpa's robe. The carriages turned onto the Mall, the wide road that leads back to Buckingham Palace. This was the final stretch of the parade. Thousands of people stood on both sides of the road, cheering and taking pictures. The children found new energy for this last part. They waved their flags with enthusiasm. Louis called out, "Hello," to the people as they passed. His voice was getting tired and scratchy, but he still wanted to greet everyone. As Buckingham Palace came into view again, the children knew their big day was almost over. The golden gates opened to welcome them back. The day had been long and exciting, full of new experiences, but now it was almost time to rest. The carriage passed through the gates and into the palace yard. Their great adventure was coming to an end, but the memories of this special day would last forever, and the pictures of the royal children would be shared around the world as the sweetest moments of the coronation. The carriages stopped in the palace yard. Helpers opened the doors. The royal family stepped out into the cool evening air. Louis jumped down from the step, too tired to wait for help this time. His legs were wobbly after the long day. Inside the palace, a special dinner was ready for the royal family. The dining room was beautiful. Candles lit the long table. Gold plates and crystal glasses shone in the soft light. Flowers from the palace gardens filled the room with sweet smells. "Are you hungry?" William asked the children. All three nodded. Even though they had snacks during the day, they were ready for a proper meal. The children were shown to their seats. George sat up straight, remembering his manners even though he was tired. Charlotte smoothed her dress before sitting down. Louis climbed onto his chair and immediately reached for a bread roll. "Louis," Kate reminded gently. Louis put the bread back and waited for everyone to be seated. King Charles entered the room. Everyone stood up to show respect for the new king. Charles smiled at his family. "Please sit," he said kindly. "It has been a long day for all of us." The king took his place at the head of the table. He looked at his 3 grandchildren with pride. "I want to thank you 3 especially," he said to them. "You helped make this day special." Louis beamed at his grandfather's words. Charlotte smiled shyly. George nodded seriously, understanding the importance of the compliment. Servants brought in delicious food. There was roast chicken, vegetables from the palace gardens, and potatoes cooked 3 different ways. For dessert, there was a special coronation cake with gold decorations. As they ate, the family talked about the day. They laughed about funny moments. Louis told everyone about the guard who winked at him. Charlotte mentioned the girls with the sign for her. George shared what he learned about the crown jewels. People around the table shared their own stories too. Everyone had seen different things during the busy day. The children listened with wide eyes to tales about parts of the ceremony they had missed. After dinner, it was time for the children to go to bed. They were staying at the palace tonight in special guest rooms. Kate helped them change out of their fancy clothes into comfortable pajamas. Louis yawned as he brushed his teeth. His eyes kept closing even as he stood at the sink. Charlotte was tired too, but she still took time to fold her special dress carefully. George asked if he could read a book about coronations before sleeping. William came to say good night to each child. He sat on the edge of Louis's bed first. "Did you enjoy being part of history today?" he asked his youngest son. "It was good," Louis said sleepily. "But next time can the planes be quieter?" William laughed and kissed Louis's forehead. By the time he pulled the blanket up, Louis was already asleep. Charlotte was next. She had many questions about the day. "Did I wave correctly?" she asked. "Did I help Louis enough?" "You were perfect," William assured her. "You're a wonderful big sister." Charlotte smiled and closed her eyes, happy with her father's praise. George was still awake when William came to his room. He was looking at a program from the Coronation. "Someday that will be you," William said gently, pointing at King Charles's picture. "And then someday it will be me," George said thoughtfully. "I want to be a good king like Grandpa." William hugged his son. "That's many years away," he said. "For now, just be a good boy. Get some sleep." As the children slept, something amazing was happening. Around the world, pictures and videos of them were being shared. News programs showed Louis covering his ears during the flyover. Newspapers printed photos of Charlotte helping her brother. Websites shared George's serious face as he watched his grandfather become king. People everywhere were talking about the royal children. "They stole the show," people said. "They made the coronation feel real and relatable." In the morning, William and Kate would show the children some of the newspapers. The front pages would be filled with their pictures. The children would be surprised to learn that on this historic day, it was their honest reactions and sweet family moments that people loved most of all. As night fell over London, the palace grew quiet. The coronation was over. A new king ruled Britain. But the stars of the day had been three young children who had just been themselves. Curious, excited, sometimes tired, but always real. And that's why people would remember this coronation for years to come.